This is going to be a long war. There will be no stability unless we have a Ukrainian victory. You know, if you don't like the price of supporting Ukraine, wait till you see the price of Russian victory.
Hello world, welcome to KYIV Not Kiev. My name is Tatiana Haiduk, and before I introduce my today's guest, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It is very important to us. So, my today's guest is Peter Dickinson. I know him as a distinguished editor of the UkraineAlert section of the Atlantic Council, as well as a publisher of Business Ukraine magazine. I always value Peter's insights on a broad range of issues concerning foreign policy, Ukraine's domestic affairs, business, investment, and today I'm eager to align our perspectives on the events that are centering around Ukraine. Peter, so very happy to have you on KYIV Not Kiev.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to join you.
Let's start with something that is both simple and complex at the same time. What is the primary message Ukraine is now sending to the world?
Well, I think the main message at the moment is that the West, when you say the world, I think the main audience is still the West, as in Europe and North America primarily, is still, this is going to be a long war, and the West needs to be prepared to fight a long war. They need to be prepared to commit the necessary resources to make sure that Ukraine wins this war, because if they don't, if Russia is able to gain even a partial victory or some form of face-saving compromise, the consequences for the entire international community would be really disastrous, and this needs to be pushed home as a message every day. And I think this is what I'm seeing from President Zelensky and from other representatives of the Ukrainian government. They're trying to put this message across as clearly as they can, as often as possible, because we are facing a period where some are saying, well, there's not as much progress as we thought in the counter-offensive, there doesn't seem to be much development on the front lines, maybe we need to talk about some form of deal. And from a Ukrainian perspective, obviously that would be catastrophic, but from an international perspective it would be no less dangerous. So it's very important to emphasize that there is really no room for a deal with Russia, as Russia is today, under Vladimir Putin, that could create a sort of stability. There will be no stability unless we have a Ukrainian victory.
How receptive is the world to this message? How ready is it to back it up with the concrete actions, not only as long as it takes, but with real actions that will lead to victory in this very particular moment?
I mean, it's varied. You know, we talk about the West. The West is not a single unit or a single entity. If we look at America, which has been the leading backer of Ukraine, the most important backer in terms of its voice, in terms of its authority, in terms of the amount of financial and military aid that it's provided, America is entering an election year now, and the situation there is very tense domestically, and Ukraine has become a kind of hostage to these domestic political tensions in America. We recently saw the removal of the Speaker from the House of Representatives in Congress, which was around the Ukraine issue. It wasn't only because of Ukraine, but it was around that issue, and I think that's going to continue. I think over the for the next year, we have the presidential elections scheduled for next November, so just over a year from now, and between now and then, there's not really much hope of a stabilization there, of a calming of these tensions. So from an American perspective, it's quite challenging at the moment. I don't anticipate that America is going to say, you know what, we're out, we're not going to support Ukraine, primarily because I think that would be disastrous for America's international standing. The Afghanistan withdrawal was a disaster for America. Did huge damage to America's international standing and reputation. And any attempt to withdraw from Ukraine, or rather pull back their support for Ukraine, would be far, far worse, would be, would be on a different scale of damage. So I don't anticipate we're going to see a full break in terms of America's position, but it is challenging at the moment. But if we look at Europe, again, it's a complex picture, but generally speaking, European countries are more and more supportive of Ukraine. They're giving a lot more. They're committing more long-term, the European Union and individual European countries, primarily Germany, are now saying, you know, we support Ukraine today, tomorrow, next year, 5 years down the line. They're putting in place plans to guarantee Ukraine's support for Ukraine that are 4 or 5 years into the future. Very large multi-billion dollar, multi-billion euro packages that will make sure that Ukraine has sustainable support over a long-term period. So I think the European picture, I think the Europeans are recognizing now this is an existential issue for them as well. This is a European issue, and they have to be there for the long term. They have to stand up and seize this, you know, seize the moment. Because for a long time, Europe was not really engaged on security issues. They were very passive. You know, after the end of the Cold War, across the board in Europe, countries cut their spending on defence very dramatically. That's now turning around, and then that is also translating into significant increases in support for Ukraine and a commitment to support Ukraine. You know, the F-16s thing is one issue where you see this, where European countries are taking the lead. Germany's just recently announced another major military aid package. They're sending more Patriots, more air defence, more equipment, more financing. These are, you know, billion euro packages. Scandinavia is very engaged. So I think that overall the picture's varied, but I don't think that we're looking at any major crises in terms of support for Ukraine. And certainly from a European point of view, the trends are very encouraging from a Ukrainian perspective. I think there's clearly a recognition in Europe that this is their war as well, and they need to win this war.
Is this Ukraine fatigue thing a real thing, or more of a construct of Russian propaganda? Both in Europe and overseas.
I mean, you know, yeah, of course Russia exploits this, but it is. I think it is real, and it is inevitable. You know, you look at anything. You know, the news cycle. You know, we live in a 24-hour, 24/7, you know, media overload. We're absolutely overloaded with information. There's only so many Russian atrocities in Ukraine that people can see before they become jaded and tired by it. It doesn't shock them anymore. You know, as depressing as it is to acknowledge, you know, after the 50th time they see a Ukrainian city reduced to rubble, it doesn't shock them anymore. You know, so there is a sense of fatigue in this sense that they are no longer shocked by it. The atrocities that are taking place are not seen as unprecedented. When the war began, the idea of a major war, the sight of tanks and artillery and bombings of a European city, was absolutely shocking. It did send shockwaves through Europe. It did cause an absolute sort of moral awakening for people. And we saw that in terms of the support that Ukraine got initially, and in the reception also for the Ukrainian refugees, which was also, you know, very overwhelming. At a time when Europeans were very hostile to a lot of different refugee and migration issues. But the Ukrainian issue was seen as unprecedented and something different. Yeah, there is a fatigue issue, of course, in the public. I think it's not so much at the political level. I think it's more in terms of you know, media and information and opinion. But overall, the perception is still that this war has to be won, and Europeans certainly recognise that.
Ukraine heavily relies on its major ally, the United States. I'd like us to look closer at the United States. American support is very valuable for us, not just in terms of finance and weaponry, but also as a marker that other allied states look to. What is currently happening in the US domestic politics, and how might this impact Ukraine?
Well, I mean, at this moment, it's paralysis. I mean, they're in uncharted territory. What we've seen over the recent weeks with the removal of Kevin McCarthy, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, is unprecedented. It's never happened before, and that one of the reasons it's happened is because they changed the rules basically to elect him, because they had such trouble electing him less than a year ago. So he was always on a very weak platform. You know, the foundations of his position were always very weak and vulnerable, and he basically fell to these conditions that he himself accepted as a compromise to be elected. That proved to be his downfall. And so Americans really now are in uncharted territory. They don't really know exactly what to expect. But we have the election looming large. They're already in election mode. And so there is a small but very vocal contingent caucus within the Republican Party, which has made American military aid and financial support for Ukraine an issue, and they've said we don't want to do this, we don't want to invest in this, and they are able, because of the nature of the American system, they're able to actually block and obstruct a lot of the processes. But at the same time, I think it's very important to underline that both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are overall, majorities are in favor of supporting Ukraine. Neither party has a majority that is against that. So taken together, there's a very strong majority in support of who back continued support for Ukraine. And that picture is the same in opinion polls that we see. Yes, people are, the numbers in terms of support for Ukraine has gone down perhaps from peaks of like 80% now to like 70, 65%. But it's still quite a clear majority of Americans, A, want to continue supporting Ukraine, and B, recognize that if Ukraine were to lose this war, if Russia were to win, it would be very, very damaging for American interests. So it's going to be complex because of the political maneuvering that's going to take place over the next year. I think we're going to have challenges, but I anticipate that they will, in the coming weeks, perhaps coming months, perhaps before the new year, pass a major funding bill for Ukraine, hopefully to see Ukraine through to the elections. And that's the goal now that I'm hearing people talk about more and more. So instead of doing it once every few months, there's a one and done, is the phrase I'm hearing now. Mm-hmm. Get it in, shut down the debate until we get to the election and make sure that Ukraine has what it needs. But it's going to be challenging because it is a political issue, and it is political season now, and it's the election campaign. Of course, the Trump factor is very large. Donald Trump will use Ukraine as a stick to beat his opponent Biden. I anticipate Trump will be the nominee for the Republican Party, so he'll continue to use that. But again, we saw this in 2015, 2016 when Trump was a candidate, and he was very, very outspoken in his comments that were very flattering to Vladimir Putin, that were very skeptical of Ukraine, that often echoed Russian talking points, Kremlin narratives, propaganda. And yet when he became president, he actually went further than his predecessor in supporting Ukraine, because that was the nature of the consensus within American politics, even though he'd taken this election campaign position, which was very much against that.
Actually, my next question is from Ukrinform, Ukrainian publication, and they wanted to know about the Trump factor. So the Trumpist wing and opponents of supporting Ukraine are growing before the US elections. If they manage to secure victory, could Ukrainians find themselves with some significantly reduced version of American aid?
Trump is a man who likes to position himself very much as an anti-establishment figure, as someone who's thinking outside the box, who's outside of the old way. That's his entire shtick, his entire narrative. He's not like the others, and that's a lot of the core of his appeal. So one of his angles is in terms of foreign policy. We don't want to get involved here. We don't want to get involved with Ukraine. We want to do deals. We want to do deals with the Chinese, with the North Koreans, and of course with the Russians. But there are limits to that sort of deal making, and I think that a lot of people have come into power in America, going back even long before Trump, who've also wanted to do deals with Russia, and then they found out that actually there is no deal to be done with Russia. I think that would be a very similar thing with Trump. And there are some people within his camp who are very extreme, but they are, the numbers are small. I think it can be easy to exaggerate their influence because the American system allows them to obstruct to a degree, and also because they're very loud and the media loves them and the media loves to put them out there. But the numbers actually are relatively small. Again, the overall majority within the Republican Party recognizes, and many of the senior members, many of the sort of elder statesmen of the Republican Party recognize that this is a core issue for American foreign policy. They recognize that it's a good deal for America. This is another factor I think that actually does appeal to some people within the Trump camp, the idea that America is able to achieve the weakening of a major American adversary in Russia for a relatively small bill. You know, they're financing Ukraine military. They're not having to commit any troops of their own. They're not having to commit any of their most powerful modern military. A lot of the stuff they're giving is actually the old inventories, the old things that they have anyway that they're providing for Ukraine. And the numbers, you know, it can look like a lot when you see, okay, 50 billion, 100 billion.
It's less than 6% of their defense budget.
Exactly. When you put it into context, when you put it into perspective, you're thinking, okay, this is actually a small portion of the defense budget. It's extremely effective use of American resources. It is achieving significant results on the ground that will have long-term benefits for American foreign policy and for American interests. So this circus will go on. We'll hear a lot of noise, we'll hear a lot of outrageous comments, but I don't think there's a realistic possibility of any major cuts. I think what we'll see is a lot of grandstanding, and I think certainly there'll be a lot of efforts to say, okay, we want to check where it's all going, we want to put in extra checks. There's already a lot of checks in place. You know, the Ukrainian military is having to provide proofs of where all the weapons they are being provided with are going, how they're being used. There's a lot of scrutiny. I think there'll be more scrutiny because that's something that the American side and certainly the Trump campaign would put an emphasis on. But it seems to me really it would be very, very reckless from an American point of view to withdraw or significantly reduce their support for Ukraine at this stage. It would, for American interest, not in terms of not on a moral level or in terms of Ukraine's interest, but simply in terms of America's interest. I think it would be extremely reckless, and I find it hard to believe that even Trump would go down that road.
Not only the US spends less than 6% of its defense budget, there are no American soldiers on the battlefield. And in the case Russia succeeds, the US has to increase significantly its defense budget. And that's a completely different geopolitical situation around it. So are Americans receptive to this very rational thing?
Well, this is the big argument now. And again, this is something I'm seeing as a sort of emerging narrative in recent weeks, in fact. You know, if you don't like the price of supporting Ukraine, wait till you see the price of Russian victory, because that's going to be 10 times higher, maybe 100 times higher. If Russia were to succeed in Ukraine, if Russia were to establish control over the areas it currently occupies, even at this level, or if they were to go further, they would not stop. And this is quite clear, I think, from anyone who knows anything about the current regime in Russia, who's had any experience of their conduct. There's really very little chance that they would stop. They would go further. Certainly they would wish to target Moldova. Certainly they would look to Central Asia. Certainly they would look to the South Caucasus. They would look to regain their influence in these areas. And then they would turn towards the Baltic states, perhaps Poland, and they would look to explore opportunities there to expand, and they would test NATO. If they are able to achieve their goals in Ukraine, then they will significantly weaken NATO. The countries of NATO on the eastern flank would feel that they are no longer fully protected. They would feel vulnerable. They would look for chinks in the armor there somehow to weaken this eastern flank, and they would test NATO. There would come a point within the next few years where Russia would militarily test the NATO Article 5, perhaps on the borders of Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania, perhaps somewhere else. And if NATO did not respond emphatically by engaging militarily with Russia, Russia would just simply go further. And of course, then we have a world war. You know, people now sort of wave the rag of World War III and Russia's nuclear arsenal as a way of deterring the West, but actually it should encourage them, this ominous prospect should encourage them to do more now, because now's the time to stop Russia. Now's the time to stop here in Ukraine. They can do it here in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian people are ready to do this. They're ready to fight. They are already fighting. They are ready to win this war. And they can. They have the ability to do it if they get the necessary support. If that doesn't happen, it becomes a much more difficult thing, and then American troops will be involved on the ground. The war will be much broader, and the costs will be infinitely higher.
Recently, the US sent a letter to the Ukrainian Presidential Office, Cabinet of Ministers, listing the priority reforms that Ukraine must implement to continue receiving assistance. It is noted that this is a document for discussions, not a strict recommendations. And here I have a question from colleagues from the Page publication. How seriously is the State Department taking this letter and execution of its conditions?
I don't know personally how seriously they take it.
What do you think?
But I would imagine, no, I would imagine quite seriously. But again, you know, it's about framing, it's about the optics of the war. Okay, we're going to defend Ukraine because they've been invaded. Okay, good, that's okay. That's clearly a fairly black and white issue. Ukraine should be supported. But the Ukrainian position has been, the sort of narrative around the war, certainly in the West, is, well, Ukraine is a democracy. Ukraine is a country that is moving in a sort of Euro-Atlantic direction. It's progressing in the way that brings them closer to us, as in terms of, you know, a civilizational sense. And so they need to be able to show that. You know, Russia is clearly a dictatorship. You know, no one needs to analyze or explain or prove what Russia is. It's obvious that Russia is a military dictatorship. It's a fascist regime. It has a Führer. It has a hardline sort of cult of personality, etc., etc. That is fairly understandable to Western audiences, but it's very important in terms of a long war to show that Ukraine is an emerging democracy, that it is becoming is liberalizing, it is reforming, it is moving forward as a nation. That is a very strong argument for Western audiences of why this is such an important war for the West to support. So it's important to be able to show these things, to be able to say, look, we need to see this. And I think the government here in Ukraine understands that. Zelensky has made a point of pushing various sort of quite visible reform efforts, the removal of the defense minister, Alexei Reznikov, over what were really quite minor infringements in the big picture. I mean, he was removed over, you know, winter coats and eggs and things like that. This is a man who's dealing with budgets that are in the tens of billions of dollars, and yet his downfall essentially was regarding corruption issues that related to millions of dollars, but, you know, again, in the big picture, you know, tiny proportion of the defense ministry budget. There was no indication or even accusations that the crimes or the infringements that his ministry was accused of were in any way related to these big budget these big budget foreign military aid. You know, again, these tens of billions of dollars that are coming into the country in terms of, you know, tanks and artillery and jet planes or whatever. They were small things, but that was seen as a sort of zero tolerance thing. We've got to get rid of it. This is not, you know, it's not good. It's a bad look for us. So the Zelensky government said, okay, you know, thank you and goodbye. We're going to get a new guy in. I think that was a very strong signal that they understood they need to be seen to be moving in the right direction as a country in terms of reform and democracy and transparency and anti-corruption measures, because that's part of the war as well. You know, where are we going with this? Is it simply just to beat Russia, push Russia back? Yeah, that's crucial. But also, where's Ukraine going to be? You know, one of the things that the Kremlin pushes is the corrupt Ukraine narrative. Now, they don't do that just because they want to, damage Ukraine's image. They know that reduces the chances of Ukraine getting support in the West. That's why they push this narrative. So they push that narrative very hard, and they use their proxies in the West to say, well, you know, Russia's bad, sure, but Ukraine's bad too. Why are we getting involved in this fight between these two bad countries? Neither of them are very good. We should just leave them to it. That's the narrative. So to counter that, Ukraine needs to be able to say, well, look, we are actually very different to Russia. We're moving in a very different direction. That's why this war's happening. That's why Russia attacked us in the first place, because we are a democratizing society, and our democracy is a threat to Russia, because Russia knows that if Ukraine succeeds in transitioning to a European democratic system and integrates into Europe, Russia, as an authoritarian empire, essentially, will be under very great threat of disintegrating, of coming apart at the seams, because so many people in Russia will say, we want that as well. We want to be like that as well.
have another question from Ukraine Forum. In the heat of the American pre-election battle, a NATO summit will take place in Washington. Under these circumstances, will Ukraine remain a focal point during the political discussions at the summit? And is there a chance that Ukraine could receive a political invitation to join the alliance?
Yes and no. Yes, it will remain the focus. As long as this war continues, it will remain the focus of NATO activity. It is a major European war, which we haven't seen since World War II. Yes, there was a war in the Balkans, or a number of wars in the Balkans, but they were on a much, much smaller scale to what we're seeing today in Ukraine. There's been nothing like this since the days of Hitler and Stalin. And it's a major, major milestone in European history, a very macabre milestone, but it's a major historical moment for Europe. So it will remain the centre of attention of NATO until this war ends, I believe, and that's clear. I don't see any alternative to that, unless the war were to spread further and we would have a major direct confrontation, of course, but assuming that's not on the cards at this point, yeah. So NATO's agenda, Ukraine will remain at the top there. In terms of a concrete invitation for membership, I think it's very clear that that will not happen until the war is over. I think NATO's made very clear that they will not do that until the war's over. There are various different versions of why that is. Personally, I believe that there is a sense within NATO that if they were to say, we now offer Ukraine a direct membership proposal and we will accept Ukraine as member in the short term, that would encourage Russia. That would make even a military decision more difficult to achieve, because it would create a more clear motive for Russia to continue the war. They, on the contrary, I think, are looking to keep it off the table now, or rather keep the idea of membership on the table, so that as soon as the war is over, then I think that will change. If Ukraine is successful in the war, if Ukraine achieves the victory that the Ukrainian people are fighting for and that the West is now pushing for increasingly, by that I mean full liberation of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, of course, and forcing the Russians to pull out entirely. If Russia is then plunged into a period of domestic instability, which I think would be very likely, very probable. I think we saw with the Wagner rebellion in June how fragile the Russian regime is, how fragile Putin's hold on the country actually is. So if they were to suffer a decisive military defeat, I think that Russia itself would be plunged into a period of chaos and instability that could be protracted. We could even have the emergence of separatist movements within Russia itself. But even without that, there would be a very long and potentially very bloody power struggle in Russia. At that point, then I think NATO membership for Ukraine becomes a very realistic proposal. It could happen relatively quickly. And we would see movement on that front. But I don't think while the war is on, you'll see that, because it's strategically, NATO regards it strategically as not a smart move in terms of the optics for Russia. And also, there's a lot of resistance within NATO to putting themselves potentially in line for war with Russia. If Ukraine becomes a NATO member while it's at war with Russia, then there's very, very, very obvious potential for NATO to be drawn into the war directly, and a lot of countries are very, very reluctant to do that.
So Ukraine can win membership only after winning the war?
Yes, that's my opinion. Yeah, that's my understanding. Hold on a minute. Ukraine doesn't really have a navy, and they're winning the Battle of the Black Sea. In the military sphere, made in Ukraine is a stamp of quality now. There's never been so much interest in Ukraine from foreign investors.
Oh, really?
Never.